In this tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how you can create a 3D carousel effect. And this is something you've probably seen on other websites, and it's a really popular kind of effect right now. But this is definitely one of those things where a client or your boss is absolutely going to love this, because there's something about a carousel that always tends to get people excited. So it's definitely a good thing to know how to do. And this is what our finished movie is going to look like. So essentially, I just have a vector graphic of the Flash logo, and then I'm placing 10 of these onto the stage in a 3D carousel layout. And then when I move my mouse to the right of center, you can see the carousel is now turning in a clockwise direction. If I move to the left of center, of course it goes back counterclockwise. And we can see that we have the illusion of 3D here, as if these things are on a 3D carousel. So let's jump over to Flash and I'll show you how to do this. Okay, here we are inside of Flash, and like always, I've taken that first layer, renamed it to Actions, and locked it. Now this is all we're going to be doing in the timeline, because everything that we're going to do here is going to be accomplished through ActionScript. So the other thing that I've done is I've created this movie clip that's basically just a vector version of the Flash logo. And these are just some of the graphics that make it up. So what we need to do now is we need to create a movie clip that contains this icon, but we also want to create a little reflection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Insert, New Symbol, and then I'm going to call this Item. Okay, so now in here, I'm going to drag out a version of the icon, and in the Align panel with two stage selected, I'm going to align it to the center vertically, and then I'm going to put it at the very top here of the registration point. Okay, so now I'm going to copy and paste that. Okay, now with this one, I'm going to go to the Modify menu, go to Transform, then Flip Vertical. So now I have a mirror image of the first one. And with it still selected, I'm going to go to the Align panel again. I'm still going to align it vertically to the center. But then I'm going to align it to the top edge, like that. So now we have a perfect mirror image of our Flash logo. But we actually want to apply a gradient mask to this so that it fades out, because obviously we don't want this reflection to be just as strong as the actual icon itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give this movie clip down here an instance name. I'm just going to call it Ref for reflection. Then I'm going to create a new layer above this. And I'm going to grab the rectangle tool. And I don't want any stroke on this. I'm just going to leave it a solid color for now. I'm just going to draw out a rectangle approximately over where that movie clip is. Okay, so what I need to do now is I want to actually make this into a gradient that goes from a solid color to transparent, because that's what when you create a gradient mask, that's what it needs to be. So I'm going to go up to the color panel, and I'm going to change the fill to a linear gradient. Now for the left side, I want to drop the alpha down to about 50, because I don't really want it to be solid anywhere. And then on the right here, I'm going to drop this alpha all the way down to 0. So now you can see we have a rectangle that fades from semi-transparent to completely transparent. Now I want to adjust this a little bit, adjust this gradient. And we won't really know exactly how this looks until we actually test the movie. Okay, so with this now, I need to turn this actually into a movie clip. So I'm going to hit F8. I'm going to call this Masker. And then also give it an instance name of Masker. So if you remember from my other tutorials about gradient masks, the only way this is going to work is if we turn on bitmap caching for both movie clips. So with this Masker movie clip selected, I'm going to come down and I'm going to check off this Use Runtime Bitmap Caching. Okay, I'm going to lock that layer now and select the reflection underneath, and also turn on bitmap caching. Okay, so the last thing we need to do, I'm just going to create another layer here. And I'm not giving these layers names, but you could. I'm going to go to the Actions panel. Now we just need to set up that mask. So I'm going to say ref, which is the movie clip for our reflection. Set mask. And now give it that masker movie clip. Okay, so now when we're using this, this ref movie clip under here is going to start out semi-transparent up here, but then it's actually going to fade out to nothing. So it'll give this icon the illusion of having a nice reflection. Okay, so let's go back out to the root timeline. Okay, so let's just quickly test to make sure that that reflection works. So I'm going to add a new layer and just drag out a copy of that item movie clip and test the movie. Okay, so now we see we have a nice reflection here underneath the icon. Okay, I want to get rid of this now and delete that layer. Okay, so one thing you want to make sure is that you set the linkage identifier for this item movie clip. So I'm going to right click, go into linkage, and then make sure export for ActionScript is checked here. Now I'm just going to use the default identifier of item. So now we're able to attach this movie clip at runtime via ActionScript. Okay, so now I'm going to highlight the first keyframe in the Actions layer and open up the Actions panel. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a series of variables that are just going to store some common information about our carousel. So the first one I'm going to call num of items, and this is going to be a number, and it's going to do exactly what it says. It's going to store how many items are going to be in our carousel. So in the end product, we're going to use 10, but just until we get the motion and the animation working, I'm just going to keep it at 1. So we're just working with one icon. Okay, now we need to create two variables that are going to represent the radius for our animation. Because with a carousel, essentially these items are moving in a circular fashion. So we're going to create one radius x variable and one radius y variable. Now if we were to have those two radiuses be the same value, you're going to get a completely, perfect circular animation. But with a carousel, we don't want a perfect circle. Basically, we want the x to be pretty wide. So let's first create that variable. So I'm going to say var radius x, and it's going to be a number. And for the radius on the x-axis, we're going to give 250. So the actual carousel is going to have a width of 250 pixels. So I'm going to create another variable called radius y. Again, it's going to be a number. Now again, if we were to give 250 here, then our icons would move in a perfect circle. But if we lower the radius on the y-axis, then it's going to be moving in an oval, which is the type of effect that we're going to want. So for this, I'm going to give a value of 75. So our carousel is going to be 250 pixels wide and 75 pixels high. Okay, now we want to store two variables that are essentially going to tell us the x and y center points for our carousel. So where is the absolute center? Where do we want the center of our carousel to be? So I'm going to say var center x. Again, it's going to be a number. And now I just want to position it absolutely in the middle of the stage. So I'm going to say stage.width divided by 2. And let me just copy this. Paste this in. I'm going to call this one center y. And then this, of course, will be stage.height divided by 2. So now this is going to be the center point for our carousel. Okay, so the last thing we want to do here is create a variable which is going to hold the speed at which the carousel spins. Now we're actually going to be creating mouse interactions to change this speed, but we still need a variable to hold it. Say var speed, data type it to a number, Now to start out with, I'm going to give it a speed of 0.05. Now this number here is one you can definitely experiment with, but you're going to need a pretty low number because anything higher, like if you were to put in 2 or 3, basically the thing would be spinning so fast you wouldn't even be able to tell. So you're definitely going to want a low number here, but you can experiment with different values. Okay, now we're ready to actually attach our icons onto the stage. So I'm going to create a for loop to do that. So for var I is equal to 0, I is less than num of items, which was again a variable holding the total number of items, and right now it's just going to be 1, and then I plus plus. Okay, so inside of this for loop, first thing I want to do is actually attach an item onto the stage. Now I'm going to actually set it equal to just a temporary variable so that I can reference it easily. So I'm going to say var t is equal to this dot attach movie. Now we need to give it the linkage identifier, and we called it item. Now we need to give it an instance name. So I'm going to say item and then concatenate on I to the end of it. So this will basically mean that the first one will be item 0, item 1, item 2, and so on. And now we need to give it a depth. So for a depth, I'm just going to give it I plus 1, because we don't want to obviously give it a depth of 0 for the first one, because that's where our root timeline is. And close that. Okay, so now the next thing we need to do is we need to give each of our items an angle, because we want to actually lay these out divided equally around the circle. So basically we have 360 degrees in a circle. We want to take 360 degrees and divide it by the total number of items, and then place each item, equally around the circle. So I'm going to create a property here. I'm going to add it onto this item movie clip we just created. So I'm going to say t.angle is equal to, now we want to say I. Remember, I just is the incrementing variable here. So we want to multiply that number by math.pi times 2. Now I'll be explaining what this means in a second. So math.pi times 2, and we're going to encapsulate that in parentheses. Now I'm going to divide that by num of items. And I'm just going to put parentheses around this. And now we can close it. Okay, so I'm sure you're wondering, what the hell did I just do? Well, it's actually pretty simple, because basically we know that there's 360 degrees in a circle, okay? But Flash actually doesn't deal with degrees. It deals with something called radians, which is essentially just a different way to measure angles. So math.pi times 2 is actually equivalent to 360 degrees. So there's basically 2 pi in a perfect circle. So here, just so that we can communicate with Flash the way it deals with angles, we're saying math pi times 2, which is equivalent of 360 degrees. Then we're going to divide that by the total number of items in our carousel. And then we're going to multiply that value by I. And then all of the items in our carousel will be perfectly spaced around the circle. And that's probably the most confusing line of code in this whole thing. It's just to remember that math.pi times 2 is just equal to 360 degrees. If you wanted half a circle, or 180 degrees, it's just math.pi. If you wanted a quarter of a circle, 90 degrees, it would be math.pi divided by 2. So it's actually pretty simple once you start working with it. Okay, so now that we've done this, I want to set up the onEnterFrame event for this movie clip, because that's what's actually going to drive the animation. So I'm going to say t.onEnterFrame is equal to mover. And this is obviously a function that we're going to write in a second. So let's quickly recap this. So here I'm just storing a bunch of variables here. First, the number of items in the carousel, then the radius. Now again, this is essentially how wide and how tall the carousel will be. Then we're just storing where we want the center of the carousel to be, and I've put it right in the middle of the stage. And then here we're holding a variable for the speed. Now we're going to go through a for loop and attach items onto the stage. And then we're going to create an angle property and attach it to that movie clip. And here we're dividing what's equivalent to 360 degrees by the total number of items. That way we have, an even division, and then multiply that amount by I, so that all the items are perfectly spaced around the circle. Then we create the onEnterFrame event. Okay, so now we're going to write that mover function. So I'm going to say function mover. Okay, so the first thing we want to do in here is to set the X and the Y position for our item. So first I'm going to do the X. So I'm going to say this._X. Now remember, because we're actually inside of that event handler assigned to the item, we can just use this to actually refer to it. Okay, so to calculate the X position, this is where we're going to start getting into some of the math functions. I just want to take a quick break just to show you this book that I highly recommend you get. Basically, if you really want to get into a lot of the physics and math used in ActionScript, this book by Keith Peters, Foundation ActionScript Animation, is essentially the absolute best book that you could buy. Basically goes through all the different types of math and physics equations that you'll need in Flash. And if you really want to kind of understand what's happening in those functions, this is a great book to get. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do for the X position is call the math.cosine function. So to this function, we need to send in the angle. Now essentially what the cosine and sine functions do is you pass in an angle, and then it's going to give you what's essentially a ratio between two sides of a right triangle. Now, again, if you read that book, you'll definitely get a better understanding of what exactly is going on there. But really, you just need to memorize that for whenever you're moving the X position, you're going to want to use cosine. Whenever you're manipulating the Y position, you'll use sine. So to the cosine function, we're going to send in that angle that we calculated here. So I'm going to say this dot angle. Okay, so now this is going to return a number between -1 and 1. So we want to take this number that's returned from the cosine function, and we want to multiply it by the total radius x, which is the total width of our carousel, which is 250. So I'm going to say radius x. Okay, so the last thing we need to do is, since we want to start this carousel at the center X position, we need to add that onto the end. So we need to add center X onto here. Okay, so again, for the X position, you're pretty much always going to want to use the cosine function. And then we're going to pass in that angle that we calculated. Then this will return a number between -1 and 1. And then we're going to multiply that by the total radius along the x-axis, which is 250. And then just to position it and center it on the stage, we're going to add the center x value to this. So if we were to test it now, basically the item would just be, completely still. In order to get this thing to actually start moving, we need to increment this angle value by this speed variable. So every time we come through the onEnterFrame, we're going to add 0.05 to our angle. So it's going to continuously recalculate the cosine, and our item will start moving. But first, let's do the y position. So I'm going to change this to this dot underscore y. Then again, we want to change this to sine. So again, it's just that memorization of cosine means x and sine means y. And that's pretty much all there is to it. And the only thing to change here is we want to actually change this to radius y. And then change this to center y. Okay, so now we've set up the x and the y position. So now, again, we want to add that speed amount to our angle every time we come through here. So I'm going to say this dot angle, then plus equals to add onto its current value. And we just want to add this dot underscore parent dot speed. So this dot underscore parent is going to get us back to the root timeline where we created that speed variable. Okay, so now let's test the movie, see what we have. Okay, so now we see our item, and it's moving perfectly in that oval. Again, it's going 250 pixels, a total distance along the x-axis, and a total distance of 75 on the y-axis. So we're getting really nice elliptical movement here. So the next thing we actually want to do is we want to scale the items so that when they're back here at the back of the carousel, we obviously want them to be slightly smaller. So let's go back here. Okay, so I'm going to come in here just above where we set the Y, and let me just get some space here. Okay, so in here, we're going to calculate what the scale should be for our item. So I'm just going to create a temporary variable called s, and that's going to be a number. Now to find that, I want to take the current y position, which I can get from this dot underscore y, and then I want to divide that by the center y position plus the radius y position. And then obviously, because of order of operations, we're going to want to put this in parentheses so that it calculates that first. Okay, so what's happening here is first we're finding out what the current y position is for our item. Then we're dividing that by the center y position, which is the center y point in our carousel, plus the total radius. So this will actually be, if we were to calculate this, 75 plus, the middle of the stage. So what that's going to do now, it's going to give us basically how far away from that center point our item is on the y-axis. So this is the number that we're going to be using to set the scale. Now again, you can experiment with this by, obviously if you wanted the scale to be even smaller so it looks like it's really going way back there, you can manipulate these values, and definitely experimentation is good when it comes to things like this. So let's set the scale now. So obviously we want it to be scale proportional, so we need to set the x scale and the y scale. So this dot underscore x scale is equal to this dot underscore y scale is equal to s, and then we actually want to multiply this by 100. Because remember, the scale properties for movie clips go from 0 to 100. So we actually want to multiply that by 100. Okay, so let's test the movie now. Now we can see that as it gets towards the back, it's actually scaling down smaller. And again, you could make it scale down even further, and you would have a sense that it was really going far back here. But for us, this is working nicely. Okay, so we've set the scale, we've set the x and the y position. Now the last thing we have to do is, because once we get a lot of items out there, we need to set the depth for these items so that they actually, overlap each other properly. But to do that, let's add some more items. So all I have to do is come up here and change this 1 to 10, and now test the movie. So now we have our carousel working perfectly, and again, they're all perfectly spaced out and moving around in our carousel. But if you notice over here, this isn't quite right, because these that are coming from here are actually in front, should be in front of these. So you can see there's some weirdness when it comes to the depths. So we need to just do a little trick just to make sure that the depths are all correct. So I'm going to come under here, and I'm going to say this dot swap depth. Okay, so now for the depths, basically I want to find out, I want to set it to the current scale of this clip. So essentially, the item with the largest scale, we obviously want to have the highest depth, and the one with the lowest scale should have the lowest depth. That way, the overlapping of movie clips is going to look correct. So I'm going to say this dot underscore x scale. This will give us the scale. But now I want to add 100 to this, because again, I just want to, I don't want to overlap the depths that our items are actually at. So just to kind of give it a buffer, I'm going to add 100 to that and close this. But now since this x scale could potentially not be a whole number, I'm going to put this into the math.round function. So now we'll have a whole number that'll start, above 100. So now the item with the largest scale is always going to be in front, and they're going to stack up perfectly in our carousel. So now we can see here over on that left edge, things are looking perfect. So the biggest one is going to have the highest depth, and the smallest one is going to have the lowest depth. So now we can see our carousel is moving perfectly just the way we want it. And again, this is very versatile because we've actually stored numbers as variables up here. So if I wanted to, and this is going to bog my system down incredibly because I'm running Camtasia as well, but here is the extreme case of 100 icons around in this carousel. Now obviously this is extreme, and you wouldn't ever do this, but it's a good example of how everything is perfectly spaced out around the carousel here. Okay, so let's bring this back to reality. Change it back to 10. Okay, so now everything is working perfectly. We just need to now add in the mouse interaction that's going to control the speed. Okay, so what we want to do is come under here and get some space. So now we want to set up the onMouseMove event for our root timeline. So whenever the mouse is moved, we're going to recalculate the speed. So I'm going to say this dot onMouseMove is equal to function. Okay, so we want to reset that speed variable. Okay, and then what we want to set it to is we basically want to find out how far away from the center of the carousel our mouse is. So to do that, I'm going to say this dot underscore xMouse minus center x. Because remember, center x is the dead center position of our carousel along the x-axis. So this is going to give us how far away I am from the center. Now if I'm to the left of center, this is going to produce a negative number, and then if I'm to the right, it's going to be positive. So this is how we're actually going to be able to get it to move in either direction depending on where my mouse is. Okay, now if we were to leave it like this, this is going to be, like I said up here, where we set the speed equal to 0.05, we need to have a really small number for the speed. So I'm just going to encapsulate this into parentheses, and now I'm going to divide this by a really large number, and again, this is going to be something for you to experiment with. But for this example, if I divide this number by 1500, it's going to give us a nice, a nice comfortable speed. And of course, the further away I get from the center, the faster the carousel is going to spin. Let's test the movie again. And now here we are, and if I keep my mouse right in the center here, you can see that the carousel stands still. If I move to the right of center, it's now spinning. And if I get all the way over here, it's spinning so fast. And another thing is this tutorial is recorded at 5 frames per second. So if you really want to see how nice and smooth this carousel is moving, definitely either recreate it or get the zip file. And then if I move to the left of center, you can see it's moving in a counterclockwise direction. Okay, so that's all there is to it. And when you see those things on the web, you probably are thinking it's, thousands of lines of code and all this crazy stuff. It's not really. It's just the cosine and the sine functions. And these two functions are capable of doing so many, crazy things as far as animation goes. And again, if you get that book that I was referring to, you'll see that most of the animations in there are done using these two functions. Okay, so this was the basics of how to create a 3D carousel. Now I plan to do a second part to this tutorial, which is going to show you, first of all, how to add mouse events to these. So, you could have some photos in here that you brought in through XML, and when you clicked on them, either it would scale up or it would take you to, Flickr or something. So I'm also going to show you basically how to have this carousel be stationary, and then when you click on any one of these, it's going to spin around so that that item is in the front. So I'm definitely going to do a part 2 of this to make it a little more complicated and a little more useful. But definitely experiment with what I've done here. And like I said, this is something that people are really going to get excited about if you show them, because just the idea that you can do 3D stuff in Flash is something that really excites people for some reason, and it does me too. So I hope you enjoyed this one, and look out for part 2.